The worst lies were never the ones spoken out loud. They were the ones stitched into silk, pressed into wedding flowers, whispered between people who smiled at you across a candlelit table while already planning how to bury you. June Ashvale had learned that too late. She had learned it with mud on her knees and blood on her palms and the taste of winter on her tongue, running through a forest she did not know, in a dress that had cost more than most people earned in a season. A dress that had been chosen for her, fitted on her, pinned and laced by hands that had never once wished her well. But she was ahead of all that now. Ahead and alone. And the trees were closing in. 3 hours earlier, June had been a bride. Not a happy one. She had stopped pretending that much, even to herself. But a bride nonetheless. Standing in the antechamber of the Greyvale Estate Chapel, candles burning low in their iron holders, the scent of white roses so thick in the air it had turned her stomach. Her maid, a quiet girl named Petra, had been adjusting the last of her veil pins when June heard the voices. She had not meant to hear them. She had not gone looking. She had simply stepped into the corridor for air because the roses were suffocating and her hands would not stop trembling, and the sound of two men talking in low, urgent tones had floated through the gap in the heavy oak door at the end of the hall. She had recognized both voices immediately. One belonged to her husband-to-be, Lord Davin Ashford. 34 years old, handsome in the way that cold things were handsome, precise, symmetrical, without warmth. He had courted her for 6 months with letters that read like legal documents and gifts that felt like receipts. June had told herself it was enough. Stability, she had reasoned. Safety. Her father was 2 years dead. Her brother Emmett had been missing for 11 months. She had no pack, no standing, no income beyond what remained of a dwindling estate. Davin had offered her a name and a roof, and she had been grateful, which she now understood was exactly the point. The other voice belonged to her stepmother, Corinna Ashvale. Pale-haired, elegant, soft-spoken, the woman who had come into her father's house when June was 14 and smiled at her like a gift she hadn't asked for, and had been smiling that same smile ever since. June had pressed herself flat against the cold stone wall and listened. After tonight, it becomes his bylaw. The Ashvale land, the mountain territory, all of it. That was Corinna. And the girl? That was Davin. A pause. A sound like wine being poured. The girl is the complication we discussed. Once the documents are signed and witnessed, she is no longer necessary. The physician has already prepared the tincture. It will look like a fever. Women in her condition, nervous, delicate, weak-blooded. No one will question it. June had stopped breathing. Her condition, Davin repeated, and there was something almost amused in it. She has no condition. She is perfectly healthy. She will not be by morning. She had stood there for 3 full seconds, maybe 4. Long enough for the words to land, to sink, to become real in the way that terrible things became real. Not all at once, but in pieces, like glass falling in slow motion. Then she had turned, walked back into the antechamber, looked at Petra, who had glanced up with the veil pin still between her fingers, and said very quietly, "I need you to leave the room." Petra had left without asking why. Good girl. June had removed her veil, folded it, set it on the chair. Then she had taken the small traveling bag she had packed 3 weeks ago on instinct, because something in her had always known, some low animal awareness she had never learned to name. And she had walked out through the servants' corridor, through the kitchen yard, through the garden gate, and into the dark. She had not run immediately. Running attracted attention. She had walked, quickly, quietly, her white skirts gathered in both fists, until the lights of the estate were gone, and the forest road was beneath her feet. Then she had run. Now, an hour deep into the Ashvale timberwoods, June was no longer running. She was walking because her legs had given out twice, and she had no intention of giving them a third opportunity. The temperature had dropped sharply. The sky above the bare branches was the color of iron, heavy with clouds that had not yet committed to rain but were threatening. Her slippers, thin, white, embroidered with silver thread, made for a chapel floor, had disintegrated somewhere around the 2nd mile. She was barefoot on frozen ground, and she could not feel her toes anymore, which she understood was not a good sign. She had no money. She had packed the bag weeks ago but had left it behind in the panic. Fool, she told herself. Stupid fool. And so she had only what was on her body. A dress. A thin undercloak she had grabbed from the antechamber hook. One small pin brooch that had been her mother's, tucked into the bodice by old habit. She did not know these woods. She had grown up on the eastern edge of Ashvale territory, where the trees were younger and thinner, and the ground was familiar. Here, on the northern border, the pines were ancient and enormous, their roots breaking the frozen earth in ridges that caught her feet. She had fallen twice. Her palms were scraped. Her knees were bruised through the silk. Her hair had come entirely free of its pins sometime in the 2nd hour, and hung in dark, damp ropes around her shoulders. She thought about Emmett. She thought about him because thinking about him was the only thing that kept her moving when her body wanted to stop. 11 months. He had disappeared 11 months ago, and no one had looked for him. Not really. Not with any genuine effort. And June had been told, gently, by Corinna, and then by the Pack Council, and then by Davin himself, that young men sometimes left. That he had probably gone west, as young men did. That grief made people see mystery, where there was only ordinary abandonment. But Emmett would not have left without word. He would not have left her alone. And now, standing in the dark with the taste of blood on her lip from where she had bitten it to keep from making noise, June understood with cold, clean certainty that his disappearance was not separate from everything else. It was connected. It had always been connected. She pressed on. The rain came without warning, the way rain did in winter, not gradually, not politely, but all at once, in heavy gray sheets that soaked through the undercloak in minutes. The white dress turned translucent and heavy. Her bare feet slipped in the mud. She caught herself on a pine trunk and stood there, forehead against the bark, breathing. Think, she told herself. Think, or you will die out here, and they will call it an accident, and Corinna will wear black for 2 appropriate weeks and sell the mountain territory by spring. She pushed off from the tree. She smelled the smoke before she saw the light. Wood smoke, resinous and real, the scent of a fire that had been burning for hours, not minutes. She turned toward it without deciding to, her body making the choice before her mind could second-guess it, following the smell through the dark between the trees, until the light resolved into something solid. A cabin. Not large. Solid stone walls, a low roof heavy with pine needles and accumulated moss, a single shuttered window with amber light bleeding through the gaps, a woodpile under an overhang to the left, a door, plain and dark, with no crest, no insignia, no indication of who lived here or what they were. June stood at the edge of the trees for a long moment. Everything she had been taught about caution, about strangers, about wolves who lived outside established territories, all of it rose in her throat at once. Then the rain intensified. She walked to the door and knocked. Silence. She knocked again, harder, and heard movement inside. Slow, deliberate movement. The kind that did not rush. The door opened. The man who filled the frame was not what she had expected. She had expected a woodsman, a trapper, perhaps an old hermit. She had not expected someone like this. Tall in a way that made the doorframe feel smaller, broad-shouldered, dressed in simple dark clothing that somehow managed to communicate authority the way expensive cloth never quite did. His hair was dark, a little longer than fashionable, pushed back from a face that was all strong lines and contained expression. His eyes, in the firelight, were the color of winter bark, dark brown, almost black, steady, and still. He looked at her. She looked at him. She was standing in the rain in a ruined white wedding dress with bare, muddy feet and blood on her palms, and she was aware of exactly how she appeared, and she lifted her chin anyway. "Can I sleep here tonight?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved. The man said nothing for a moment. His eyes moved across her, not the way men's eyes usually moved across her, evaluating, assessing, but the way a person scanned for damage. Her feet, her hands, the state of the dress. Her face last, and then held there. "Come inside," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. It carried the particular weight of someone who did not need to raise it to be heard. June stepped across the threshold, and the warmth of the cabin hit her like a physical thing. The heat of the fire, the scent of pine resin and cedar and something beneath it. Something clean and dark that she couldn't name and didn't try to. She stood on the stone floor and dripped and tried not to shiver and failed. The man closed the door behind her. He did not ask her name. He did not ask why she was in the woods in a wedding dress at night in the rain. He moved to a wooden chest by the far wall, opened it, and pulled out a folded wool blanket and a pair of thick wool socks, which he set on the chair nearest the fire without a word. Then he stepped back, putting distance between them, and looked at her again. "Sit," he said, "before you fall." June sat. She did not know his name. She did not know whose cabin this was. She did not know if she was safe or if she had simply traded one danger for another, which was a thought she was too cold and too exhausted to fully examine yet. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and felt the warmth begin, slowly, to reach her skin. Outside, the rain continued to fall. She was still alive. For tonight, that would have to be enough. She woke before the fire did. The embers were still breathing, orange and low, throwing just enough light to make the cabin readable. And June lay on the narrow cot the man had prepared for her without fanfare, a rough wool blanket tucked around her shoulders and the dry socks still on her feet, and stared at the ceiling beams and took stock of herself the way she had learned to after bad nights. Hands, scraped, scabbed, functional. Feet, sore, but feeling had returned. Dress, hanging near the fire on a wooden peg, still damp at the hem. Mind, too quiet. The kind of quiet that came after a door had been slammed very hard and all the furniture had stopped rattling. She had slept. That surprised her. She had not expected to sleep. Had expected to lie awake cataloging every way the night could still go wrong. But somewhere between sitting by the fire and trying to form a coherent plan, exhaustion had simply claimed her without asking permission. 4, maybe 5 hours. The window behind the shutters was beginning to suggest gray morning. She sat up carefully and looked across the cabin. The man was at the table, not sleeping, sitting with a cup of something hot, reading by the light of a single candle, utterly still in the way that very controlled people were still, not tense, not watchful, simply present. He had not woken her. He had not, as far as she could tell, moved her or touched her, or done anything at all beyond exactly what he had said he would do, which was let her sleep. He looked up when she moved. "There's water in the pot," he said, "and bread on the board." June looked at the small iron pot hanging at the edge of the hearth, then at the wooden board on the table's edge, where a half loaf of dark bread waited with a small ceramic pot of something amber. Honey, she realized. The domestic simplicity of it hit her somewhere behind the sternum, and she did not examine that feeling closely. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was rough with sleep. She stood, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and moved to the hearth to pour water into the clay cup he had left there. Her hands were steadier than last night. That was something. She sat at the far end of the table and ate without speaking, and he read without speaking, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable, which itself was strange enough to note. Most silences with people she did not know were filled with the pressure of expected performance. She had spent years learning to fill silences correctly, to say the right things, to smooth the right edges. This silence asked nothing of her. She tore off a second piece of bread. "You're not going to ask," she said finally. Not accusation. Observation. He turned a page. No. Most people would ask. Most people, he said, without looking up, would have made you explain yourself at the door before letting you in. That was accurate. June looked at her bread. I'm not going to tell you anyway. I know. She looked at him then, properly, in the morning gray. In the firelight of the previous night she had registered size, steadiness, dark eyes. Now she registered more. The quality of his stillness, which was not passivity but something more deliberate. The way his hands held the book. Large hands, careful, without rings. The line of his jaw, the faint marks on his knuckles that spoke of something other than a life spent only reading. He was not young, but he was not old. Somewhere in his middle 30s, perhaps. It was difficult to place him, which itself was interesting. Most men of his physical presence announced themselves loudly. This one did not seem to feel the need. The dress, he said. He was still looking at his book. June waited. It's a wedding dress. Yes. You were running from a wedding. I was running, she said carefully, from what came after. He looked up then, just for a moment, and then back down. But in that moment, she had the distinct sensation of being seen without being examined, which was different from anything she could remember. There are people who will come looking, she said. For the bride who disappeared. I should move on before. The roads north are flooded from last night's rain, he said. You won't make it to the next township on foot in this weather. June opened her mouth and closed it. She looked at the shuttered window, behind which the morning was clearly gray and wet and cold. How long? She asked. A day. Maybe 2, if the temperature drops again. She sat with that. A day. Maybe 2. Davin would have people searching by now. Not because he was heartbroken. She understood that with perfect clarity. But because a missing bride was a problem. A missing bride who had overheard something she was not supposed to hear was a catastrophe. He would need to find her before she reached anyone she could speak to, which meant she needed to reach someone she could speak to before he found her. But the roads were flooded, and her feet were still bruised, and she had no money, and no name she could safely claim. And the nearest pack settlement that did not fall under Greyvale influence was... She tried to calculate and found her geography uncertain. Where is this cabin? She asked. What territory? A pause. Brief, but there. Northern borderland, he said. The edge of the Veyrath range. June went very still. Veyrath. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name, in the way that everyone knew the names of things too large and too far away to feel immediate. The Veyrath range was not controlled by any of the southeastern packs. It was not governed by the council lords her stepmother had spent years cultivating. It was, by every map she had ever seen, the outer territory of the Veyrath crown, which was not a pack exactly, but something older, something that operated under its own laws, its own hierarchy, and answered to no council she had ever sat near. She was further north than she had realized. Far further. Veyrath range, she repeated slowly. Yes. And this cabin belongs to someone who is not going to hand you over to whoever you ran from, he said, with a quiet finality that did not invite further questioning in that direction. June looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes, held them, and then returned to his book. She should have pressed. She was aware she should have pressed. But there was something in the directness of his answer. Not a deflection, not a lie, a simple and specific reassurance that made the question feel less urgent than it had a moment ago, which was itself worth being suspicious of, and she filed it away. She finished the bread, stood and took her cup to the hearth and refilled it. I need to find someone, she said, to the fire more than to him. Someone who went missing 11 months ago. My brother. He was 23 when he disappeared. She did not know why she was saying this. She had not planned to say anything. The people who were responsible for finding him chose not to. I understand now that was deliberate. The scratch of the page turning stopped. She did not look back. He is not the kind of person who disappears willingly. He would not have left me. And the same people who didn't look for him are the same people who... She stopped, pressed her lips together, looked at the steam rising from her cup. I need to find him. Before I do anything else, before any of the rest of it, I need to know if he is alive. Silence. Then, from behind her, his voice. What is his name? She turned. He was looking at her now, fully, the book set flat on the table. His expression had not changed. It was still that same contained, unreadable steadiness. But there was something in the quality of his attention that had shifted. Emmett, she said. Emmett Ashvale. Something moved behind his eyes. Small, brief, quickly contained. Too quickly, she thought. The way a person contained a reaction they had not expected to need to contain. Her stomach tightened. You know that name. It was not a question. He did not answer immediately. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and she could see him weighing something. Not whether to lie, she realized, but how much truth to give her, and in what order. And she found that distinction both reassuring and alarming. I may know something, he said carefully, about a man by that name. The cup in June's hands was suddenly very fragile. She set it down. Tell me, she said. Her voice had gone very quiet. Whatever it is, tell me. He is alive, the man said. The breath she released was not elegant. It was not contained or dignified or anything she would have chosen. It came out of her chest in a single ragged exhale that she had to press her fist against her sternum to follow, and she stood there at the hearth and breathed, and the fire crackled, and outside the rain fell on the pine needles, and she was shaking again, but differently than before. Where? She managed. Another pause. Measured, not cruel. That, he said, is a longer conversation. One that will require you to trust me slightly more than you do. June looked up at him. He was still at the table, still several feet away, making no move toward her. And something about that, the deliberate distance, the absence of any pressure, made her chest feel complicated in a way she didn't have vocabulary for yet. I don't trust easily, she said. Especially not. She stopped herself. Especially not men, he finished, without inflection. Especially not anyone, she corrected, but particularly not strangers who won't tell me who they are. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with something that was not quite a sigh and not quite resolve, but somewhere between both. My name is Lucian. He said it the way someone said a name that usually caused a reaction. Waiting. Watching. Giving her space to process it. June turned it over. Lucian. She searched her memory, her education, the political geography she had absorbed through years of a father who took her seriously and taught her the names of power. Lucian. Lucian Veyrath. The Alpha King. She stared at him. He looked back, utterly calm, and said nothing, and let her arrive at it herself. The cabin. The northern border. The absence of pack crests because no crests were needed, when the man himself was the highest authority in 6 territories. The quality of his stillness. The way the space around him felt different, not threatening, but significant. The way the air felt different near something very old and very large. She had knocked on the Alpha King's door in a ruined wedding dress and asked if she could sleep there. June sat back down, very slowly, into the chair. Oh, she said. Lucian turned to a new page. Finish your breakfast, he said. Then we'll talk about your brother. The rain did not stop that day. It fell in slow gray curtains against the shuttered windows, and the cabin held its warmth with the stubbornness of old stone. And June sat across from the Alpha King of 6 territories at a plain wooden table and tried to remember how to think. She was not doing a particularly good job of it. You said he was alive, she said. Third time she had returned to those words. She could not seem to move past them into the next part of the conversation without touching them again, making sure they were still true. Emmett, he's alive. Yes. Lucian had set the book aside. He sat with his forearms on the table, hands loosely clasped, and watched her with that particular patience that she was beginning to understand was not performance. It was simply how he existed. Unhurried. Undemanding. He was found on the northern ridge 7 months ago. Alone, injured, without pack identification. My border guards brought him in. 7 months, June calculated. That meant Emmett had disappeared from Ashvale territory 4 months before Lucian's men found him. 4 months she could not yet account for, and the gap sat in her chest like something swallowed wrong. Injured how? She asked. A brief pause. Significantly. I need more than that. Lucian looked at her for a moment, and then, without apparent reluctance, he gave it to her. 3 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, signs of prolonged confinement, his wrists, his ankles. He had not eaten properly in weeks. He said it plainly, without softening it, which she appreciated, and simultaneously had to work to receive. He was conscious when they found him. That mattered. June pressed her thumbnail into her palm under the table, hard enough to ground her. Was it Davin's people? We didn't know at the time who was responsible. Your brother was not speaking much when he arrived. A pause. He has spoken more since. He recovered well physically. The rest takes longer. Where is he now? In Veyroth's main settlement, under my household's protection. Lucian held her gaze steadily. He is safe, June. I give you my word on that. It was the first time he had used her name. She had not told it to him, which meant he had known it before she said it, which meant she turned that over carefully and set it aside for later examination, because there were only so many revelations she could process in a single morning without losing her footing entirely. He told you about me, she said. He told me he had a sister, that she was alone, in Ashvale territory, surrounded by people he did not trust. Something in Lucian's expression shifted. Not much, but enough. He was very specific about his concern for you. He didn't know about Davin. She heard the flatness in her own voice. About the marriage. No. He knew about your stepmother, about the estate. He suspected the land was the primary interest, not... Lucian stopped himself in a way that felt deliberate. Not me, June finished. You can say it. I arrived at the same conclusion last night, in slightly more dramatic fashion. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. There and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. The land, she said. The Ashvale Mountain Territory. It borders Veyroth Range. She was thinking out loud now, fitting pieces together. Which means if Davin Ashford controls it through marriage, he controls the southern approach to Veyroth, Lucian said, and removes the last independent buffer between my territory and the Greyvale Council's influence. And my stepmother has been working with the Greyvale Council. For longer than you likely know. June sat with that. She looked at the rain against the shutters. She thought about 6 months of courtship letters that read like legal documents, and Corinna's pale hand resting on Davin's arm at dinner as if it belonged there, and the way nobody had looked for Emmett. Not really, and how she had been so focused on survival that she had mistaken endurance for safety. They needed me to sign, she said slowly. The marriage documents. For the land transfer to be legal, I had to consent to it. And then you were no longer needed, Lucian said, quiet, direct. Yes. And Emmett was removed because he would have stopped it, or tried to. She pressed her fist against the table. Not hard, just grounding. He would have come back for me. He tried, 3 times by his account. The last time cost him considerably. The weight of that settled on her like something physical. 3 times. Her brother had tried to come back for her 3 times and had been stopped, hurt, imprisoned for it. And she had been sitting in Greyvale Estate accepting condolence looks and wearing fitted dresses and telling herself that absence sometimes meant choice. "I should have known," she said. "You survived," Lucian said. "That was not incidental. That was difficult." She looked at him sharply, because she was accustomed to that sentiment being offered as consolation, as the thing people said when they wanted you to feel better without requiring anything of themselves. But there was nothing consoling in his tone. It was a simple observation, a statement of fact, offered the way he seemed to offer everything, without decoration. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then looked away. "I need to see him," she said. "Emmett. I need to see him before anything else. That can be arranged. Today. The roads. I heard you about the roads." She folded her hands on the table. "I am not suggesting I walk. I am asking whether there is another way, and I am asking it of a man who commands 6 territories, and presumably has resources beyond a flooded dirt road." A pause. Then, "There is a route through the High Pine Ridge. It requires horses. It is not comfortable in this weather." "I spent last night barefoot in a winter forest in a wedding dress," June said. "Comfortable is not my current priority." This time the thing at the corner of his mouth resolved into something more definite, brief, controlled, but real. "I'll have the horses prepared," he said. The ride took 2 hours along paths that were less roads than intentions, narrow tracks through ancient pine, the ground hard under a thin crust of frost that the rain had not yet softened. Lucian rode beside her on a dark horse that moved with the same unhurried authority as its rider, and he did not fill the silence with conversation, which she was grateful for. She was not ready to talk. She was not ready for anything except the destination. He had given her a cloak, heavy wool, dark green, lined with something warmer than she deserved, and boots from a chest in the cabin that were too large but infinitely preferable to the alternative. She had not asked whose they were. She had not asked a great many things, which was unusual for her. Normally, in uncertain situations, she gathered information compulsively, turned it over, built pictures. Now she was conserving herself the way you conserved water in a drought, not wasting attention on questions that could wait, directing everything toward the only one that mattered. Emmett. The Veyrath settlement resolved out of the tree line with the suddenness of things that were deliberately not visible until you were meant to see them. It was larger than she had expected. A walled compound of stone and timber, not a castle, but not modest either. The kind of place built by people who expected to defend themselves and also expected to endure. Torches burned at intervals along the outer wall despite the daylight. Guards at the gate stood straight when they saw Lucian, and she caught the flicker of their attention moving to her. To the borrowed cloak, the oversized boots, the dark hair still escaping whatever order she had managed to impose on it with her fingers during the ride. And she held her chin level and looked through them the way her father had taught her when she was 10 years old. "You are an Ashvale," he had said. "You look through walls when walls are in your way." Inside the gate, Lucian dismounted and handed his reins to a stable hand without speaking. June dismounted herself before anyone could offer to help her, which earned her a brief look from a broad-shouldered guard that she could not fully interpret and did not particularly care about. Lucian was already walking. She followed, through a stone corridor, down a short stair, through a door that opened into a wide lower hall with a fire burning at the far end, and she saw him before she was ready, before she had prepared herself, which was probably better, because preparation would have made it precious, and this was already almost more than she could carry. Emmett was sitting at a table near the fire. He was thinner than she remembered, and the line of his shoulders held something it hadn't before. A careful quality, a guardedness. But he was reading, which was so precisely himself that she almost laughed. He looked up when the door opened. He saw her. He stood so fast the chair scraped back and hit the wall. June crossed the room and he met her halfway, and she held onto her brother with both arms and her face pressed against his shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing that could go first. Everything was happening at once. 11 months of not knowing. 11 months of telling herself a story about ordinary absence and half believing it, because the alternative was unbearable. And now here was the solid reality of him. Thinner and marked by things she would ask about later. But breathing. Warm. Alive. He held her the way people held things they had almost lost. "I tried to come back," he said into her hair. His voice was rough. "June, I tried." "I know," she said. "He told me." She felt Emmett go still. Then, very carefully, "How much do you know?" "Most of it." She pulled back and looked at his face, the small scar near his jaw that had not been there before, the shadows under his eyes that sleep had not yet fully repaired, and something that had been knotted in the center of her chest for 11 months, loosened, slowly, like a fist opening. "Tell me the rest." He glanced past her, at Lucian, who had stopped near the doorway and stood there with his hands at his sides and no particular expression. "He found you," Emmett said. Not a question. Something moved across his face. Complicated, not entirely readable. "He actually found you." June turned to look at Lucian. Lucian said nothing. "What does that mean?" June said quietly. Emmett looked at her, then at Lucian again, then at his hands briefly, in the way of someone deciding what order to say things in. "When I was well enough to speak," he said, "I told him about you. About what I suspected Corinna was planning. About the marriage." He paused. "He sent people to look for you, June. 3 weeks ago. They didn't find you in Greyvale." She processed that. 3 weeks ago. Which meant Lucian had known who she was before she knocked on that door, had been looking for her, or at least for information about her, before she arrived soaking wet and barefoot in his forest. She turned back to face him. He met her eyes without apology, without explanation, and waited. "You knew," she said, "when I knocked. You knew who I was." "I suspected," he said. "By the time you mentioned your brother's name, I was certain." The fire crackled. Outside, the rain continued. June stood in the space between her brother and the man who had sheltered her without conditions, and felt the ground shifting under her again, but differently than it had last night in the dark. Last night, the ground had gone out from under her. This time it was rearranging itself into something she didn't yet have a name for. "And you still didn't say anything," she said. "You let me sleep. You gave me bread." "You needed to sleep," he said simply. The rest could wait until morning. She did not know what to do with that. She filed it next to all the other things she was not ready to examine yet, in that interior cabinet that was filling up faster than she could manage. "There is more you need to know," Emmett said beside her. His voice had shifted, quieter, more deliberate. "About Corinna. About what she gave Davin access to. About what they were planning to do with the mountain territory, and why it matters beyond just the land itself." June straightened. "Tell me." "There are documents," Emmett said, "hidden in the Ashvale estate. Father's original land agreements. The real ones, not the copies Corinna has been using. If we can retrieve them, they prove that the territory cannot be transferred by marriage at all. It was designated as held in trust. For us." June was very still. "They built an entire conspiracy," she said slowly, "on a foundation that was never legally theirs to take." "Yes." She exhaled. Long, controlled. "Then we're going to take it back," she said. The council room in Vayreth's main hall was not what June had expected. She had grown up adjacent to power, had sat at the edges of pack councils her whole life, watching men arrange themselves around tables with the careful choreography of people who believed their seating positions communicated something essential about their importance. Those rooms had always smelled of candle wax and self-regard. They had always been loud in a specific way, even when quiet, loud with the weight of egos pressed against each other like stones. This room was different. It was long and low-ceilinged, with heavy timber beams and a single row of narrow windows along the north wall that let in gray winter light without pretending to warmth. The table was old oak, dark with age, ringed by chairs that were solid and unornamented. Maps covered one entire wall, hand-drawn, meticulous, marked in several colors of ink with notations she couldn't read from across the room. There were no decorative tapestries. No crests hung above the fireplace. The fire itself was functional rather than ceremonial, burning clean and hot, and the room smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and something faintly metallic. It smelled like a room where decisions actually got made. Lucian stood at the head of the table. At his right sat a woman June had not met yet, perhaps 40, with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone who had stopped performing patience decades ago and simply embodied it. Her name, Emmett had told her in a quiet aside, was Sarah. She served as Lucian's chief strategist and had, in Emmett's estimation, a mind like a blade kept in a cold place. To Lucian's left sat an older man with a gray-streaked beard and a council advisor's mark embroidered on his collar. 2 more of Lucian's senior guard completed the circle, and then Emmett and June. She was still wearing the borrowed cloak. She had not been given time to find anything else, and she had not asked, and she did not apologize for it. She sat straight in her chair and kept her hands flat on the table and looked at the maps on the wall and waited. "The documents your brother described," Lucian said, without preamble, "would be held in the estate's archive room. Eastern wing, lower level. That's the standard configuration for Ashvale-era construction." He glanced at June. "Can you confirm the layout?" "Yes," she said. "The archive is behind the estate steward's office. There's a second entrance from the garden corridor. Servants used it for record deliveries. It's less watched than the main hall." "Watched by how many guards currently?" "Davin keeps 8 on rotating shifts. He brought 6 additional men from his own pack when the engagement was formalized." She paused, running the interior map of the estate through her mind, the way she had walked it 1,000 times. "The additional 6 are loyal to him personally, not to the estate. They don't know the building well." Sarah looked at her with an expression that was not quite approval, but was adjacent to it. "How do you know the guard rotation?" "Because I paid attention," June said. "When you are in a house where you suspect something is wrong, you pay attention." A small silence. "The documents," the council advisor said, leaning forward, "would need to be authenticated before they could be presented to any formal body. Originals carry weight. Copies can be contested." "They are originals," June said. "My father kept duplicates of nothing he considered foundational. He said copies were for people who expected to be doubted." "Your father sounds like he was a careful man," Sarah said. "He trusted the wrong woman eventually," June said. "But yes, before that, he was careful." Emmett reached under the table and pressed 2 fingers briefly to the back of her hand. She did not look at him. She breathed through it. "There is a window," Lucian said. He moved to the map wall and pointed to a section of the Eastern Territory, a road she recognized, the route that ran from the Northern Pack Road down to Greyvale's outer boundary. "Davin will expect pursuit from the southern roads. His search pattern will prioritize the village routes and the main trade corridor. He will not, initially, expect any movement from the north." He turned. "Which means we have perhaps 2 more days before he recalibrates and begins looking in this direction." 2 days, June said. "Enough if we move tonight." He looked at her directly. "This requires someone who knows the estate from the inside, someone who can locate the archive room in the dark and verify the correct documents on site." A pause. "I am not going to ask you to go, but I need to know if you are willing." June looked at him. She thought about the archive room, the smell of it. Old parchment and dried lavender her father had tucked between the shelves to keep the moths out. The particular creak of the 3rd drawer, down on the left side cabinet, the way the room held cold even in summer because it sat below ground level. She thought about her father's handwriting, which she would recognize in an instant and could not describe to anyone else in a way that would be equally reliable. "I'm willing," she said. "June," Emmett started. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. You went back 3 times. It's my turn. Her brother closed his mouth. He looked at the table. Then he nodded, once, with the precise combination of pride and fear that she recognized as the specific expression of someone who loved you and knew they couldn't stop you. I'll go with her, Lucian said. 3 others from the guard, small enough to move without pattern, large enough to manage complications. You shouldn't go personally, the council advisor said immediately. If something goes wrong, Lucian said, in a tone that closed the argument the way a heavy door closed a room. I would rather be there than here. The advisor subsided. June looked at Lucian across the table. He was not looking at her for permission or agreement. He was simply stating what he intended to do. But there was something in the quality of his attention when it returned to her. Brief, steady, anchoring, that she found herself storing without meaning to. They left at midnight. 5 of them, on horseback, moving through the high pine route without torches. June had been given a proper riding cloak by then, and boots that actually fit, sourced from somewhere in the settlement by a young guard who had produced them without comment, and with the efficiency of someone who had served Lucian long enough to know that explaining was less useful than delivering. She had also been given a small knife, which she had tucked into her boot with a familiar ease that had earned her a look from Sarah, who was not coming on the ride, but had stood at the gate and looked at June for a long moment before they mounted. Don't be brave when careful will do, Sarah had said. I've been careful for years, June had replied. I'm reconsidering the strategy. The corner of Sarah's mouth had moved. The night was clear and bitterly cold, the rain having finally stopped an hour before midnight and left the air scrubbed and sharp. The stars were very bright, the horse's breath clouded in the dark. June rode without speaking, tracking landmarks she knew. A particular bend in the ridge path, the rock formation that looked like a collapsed doorway, the smell of the river that marked the boundary between Veyrath's outer range and the unaffiliated land that buffered Ashvale territory. Lucian rode beside her, close enough that she could see his profile against the tree line, far enough that there was no pressure to it. You know this route, he said quietly, at the river crossing. My father used to ride north in autumn, she said. I came with him twice. I have a good memory for terrain. That will matter tonight. She looked at him. In the starlight, his face was all shadow and angle. You didn't have to come, she said. Not gratitude, exactly. More like acknowledgement. I know. You could have sent the guard. Yes. Then why? Because you are walking back into a place where people plan to kill you, he said. And I don't send people into situations I'm not willing to enter myself. She held that in silence for a moment. The horses stepped through the shallow river crossing, water black and silver in the starlight. That's about principle, she said. Not specifically about me. He glanced at her. It can be both. She looked away first. She did not examine why. The Ashvale estate was quiet in the way of places that had recently experienced disturbance and were still vibrating with its aftermath. The outer grounds showed signs of hasty search. Gates left unlatched, a bucket overturned near the stable that no one had righted, a lantern left burning at the side entrance that would normally have been doused at midnight. Davin's men were searching elsewhere. That much was clear. They entered through the garden gate. June knew where the latch was, had known since she was 8 years old, and had discovered that knowledge was the best form of independence available to a child in a large house. The garden was dead in winter, the beds dormant, the stone paths slick with frost. She moved through it quietly, and the others followed without sound. The servants' corridor was unlocked, also telling, someone had come through here recently in a hurry. Inside, the estate held its cold, and its dark, and its particular smell. Wood polish, old stone, the ghost of those white roses, which made her stomach clench, and underneath everything, the familiar dusty scent of her father's house, which hurt in a completely different way. This had been home. It had been contaminated so gradually she hadn't noticed until the contamination was complete. She led them through the back passage without hesitation, counting doors by feel. Second left, third right, down the half stair, past the steward's office. The door was ajar, papers scattered across the floor inside. Someone had already searched it. That meant the archive room was at risk. She quickened her pace. The archive room's garden entrance was a low door set into the foundation wall, half hidden by a dead climbing vine. June crouched, found the iron handle, pulled. It resisted. She pulled harder. Lucian's hand came over hers, not taking over, just adding weight. And the door opened with a sound like an exhale. Inside, the archive smelled of lavender and cold and old paper. The shelves were intact. No one had searched here yet. It was too obscure, too specific. They would have needed to know it existed. June moved to the left wall, third cabinet, second drawer from the bottom. Her hands found the handle in the dark, and she pulled it open and felt inside. Paper, rolls of paper, the particular stiff texture of formal parchment. And she found the ribbon-tied bundle that had a different weight than the others. Heavier, sealed with her father's ring mark pressed into dark wax. She held it up. One of the guards held a small shielded candle close enough to see. Her father's handwriting. His seal. His mark. Real. She held it against her chest for one moment, eyes closed, hand flat over the wax seal. Her father's careful, meticulous handwriting. His insistence on foundation. His belief that truth, properly recorded, did not require witnesses to survive. You were right, she thought. It survived. We have it, she said quietly. Lucian was close behind her in the narrow space, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. Can we go? He asked, very low. Yes. She tucked the documents inside her cloak, flat against her ribs. Let's go. They were back through the door and into the garden when the light appeared, a torch, moving fast, from the direction of the main house. A shout, then 2 more torches. They found the garden gate, one of the guards said. Move, Lucian said. They ran. June ran with the documents pressed against her ribs and frost cracking under her boots and the shouts growing behind them. And she ran the way she had run 2 nights ago, through a different dark, in a different kind of fear. But this time, she was not running blind. This time she knew where she was going. This time there were people running beside her, and one of them was Lucian, who matched her pace exactly and said nothing, and simply ran. And the gate was ahead, and the horses were beyond it. And behind her the torches were falling further behind, and she was going to make it. She made it. They rode through the night without stopping. By the time Veyrath's walls appeared through the pre-dawn gray, June's hands had stopped shaking. The documents were still pressed flat against her ribs, held there by her own arm and the pressure of the cloak, and she had checked for them 6 times during the ride with the compulsive certainty of someone carrying something irreplaceable. Each time her fingers found the stiff edge of the parchment bundle, she exhaled. And each time she exhaled, she felt Lucian's attention move briefly to her from the corner of her awareness. Though he never said anything. They were let through the gate without ceremony. The settlement was beginning to wake. A kitchen fire lit here, a stable lantern there, the low sounds of a place resuming itself after a night of careful waiting. Emmett was in the main hall when they came through the door, and June understood from the state of him, seated but clearly not slept, a cup of something cold and forgotten on the table beside him, that he had not moved since they left. He stood when he saw her. She crossed the room and put the documents in his hands. He looked down at them, at the seal, at their father's handwriting. Something crossed his face that was too layered to name. Grief and relief and fury, and something that might, eventually, become peace. And he pressed the bundle briefly to his forehead with both hands, and breathed. Right, he said after a moment. His voice was steady. Then we end this. The formal proceeding took 4 days to arrange. Lucian sent word through the appropriate channels, not to the Greyvale Council, which was compromised, but to the 3 independent arbiters who held authority over interpack land disputes under the old compact. It was, as Sarah explained to June over the first morning's breakfast with the efficient cheerlessness of someone who found politics distasteful but unavoidable, a legal mechanism that predated the current council structure by 200 years. It could not be blocked by Greyvale influence. It could not be delayed by Davin's objections. And once convened, its findings were binding in all 6 territories. "Corinna will know something is happening," June said. "She already does," Sarah said. "She has known since your disappearance that her position is unstable. The question was never whether she would panic. The question is whether she moves first." She looked at June over her cup. "She won't get the chance." During those 4 days, June existed in a state she had no previous framework for. She was not recovering. Recovery implied a return to something prior, and prior was not a place she wanted to go back to. She was not yet fighting. That was coming, but it was not here yet. She was in the space between, which she filled with things that were concrete and useful. Reviewing the documents with Emmett, working through the estate records that Sarah's people had quietly sourced from the territorial archive, learning the shape of her father's real intentions for the land she had grown up on without fully understanding she was inheriting. The mountain territory was not simply land. It was, as the original agreements made clear, a designated neutral corridor between the 2 great northern and southern pack systems, a buffer that her father had deliberately held independent, refusing affiliation with either Greyvale or Veyrath precisely because its independence was its value. Corinna had not understood that, or had understood it and not cared, which was worse. What she had tried to sell to Davin was not a property but a geopolitical mechanism, and in doing so she had destabilized something her father had spent 20 years maintaining. June read that and sat with it, and felt her father's care radiating up from the old pages, like warmth from a stone that had spent a long time in the sun. "He knew what it was worth," Emmett said beside her. "He knew what everything was worth," June said. "He just trusted the wrong person with it." Emmett was quiet for a moment. She was good at that, being trusted. "Yes," June said. She was. On the second evening, Lucian found her in the map room. She had not been able to sleep, had tried, had lain in the dark of the room she had been given and found her mind moving too fast, too many things assembling and reassembling, and had eventually given up and gone to the room she found most calming, which surprised her, because it was not a room she had sought out deliberately. She had simply walked until she was somewhere quiet and ended up there. He came in without knocking, which she had noticed was not rudeness, but simply his way. He knocked on doors when he was uncertain of welcome, and did not when he had already assessed it. He stopped when he saw her at the wall, one candle lit, looking at the map of the Ashvale territory. "You should sleep," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not able to." He came to stand beside her, not close enough to crowd. Close enough that she was aware of him in the particular way she had become aware of him, not with alarm, not with the defensive calculation she had applied to every man in her vicinity for longer than she could honestly remember, but with something more like orientation, the way you were aware of a fixed point. "There," she said, touching the map near the mountain boundary. "That's where the summer cabin was. We spent a month there every year until my mother died." She traced the ridgeline. "And there, that's where Emmett and I found a wolf den when we were children. We were terrified and completely unable to leave. We watched them for 2 hours." She paused. "I think that was the first time I understood that something could be frightening and beautiful at the same time." Lucian was looking at the map, or at her hand on the map. She wasn't certain which. "What will you do with it?" he said. "If you get it back." "When?" she said. "When I get it back." A pause. "When?" She considered. She had been considering for days, in the spaces between the practicalities. "I'll keep it independent," she said. "The way my father intended. I won't affiliate it. I won't sell it. I'll administer it from within. Actually, within, not from a distance." She looked at the ridgelines. "Emmett can help. He was always better with people than I am. I'm better with logistics. That's an accurate self-assessment, Lucian said. She looked at him. You've known me 4 days. 4 days, he agreed, is enough to observe that you read a room before you enter it, and that you have not once asked for help with something you believed you could manage yourself. She returned to the map. Is that a criticism? No, he said. It's recognition. The candle flame moved in some current she couldn't detect. The map room held its quiet. Outside, the settlement was dark and still. Lucian, she said, carefully. Yes. You have been... She stopped, started again. You have not asked anything of me. Through any of this. You gave me shelter, and your guard, and access to your counsel. And you went personally into a situation that your own advisor told you was not your risk to take. She paused. I want to understand why. A silence, not evasive, considered. Your brother told me about you, he said, before you arrived. He described you with the specificity of someone describing someone essential. He was looking at the map now, not at her. And then you knocked on my door, and you were exactly as he described. And also not at all, because he had only told me the shape of you, and shapes are insufficient. A pause. I helped you because it was right, and because I wanted to. He looked at her then. Those aren't separate reasons. She held his gaze. She was aware of the bond, had been aware of it, in a peripheral and carefully unexamined way, since the first morning at the table. It was not loud. It was not insistent. It was simply there, the way pressure was there, steady and undeniable, and she had been keeping it at the edges of her attention, because she did not trust the thing that had been called bond, and mate, and destiny, by people who had used those words as instruments. I know what you are to me, she said. Quiet, direct, the way he was direct. I think I've known since the first morning. I want you to know that I know. He waited. I'm not ready, she said. Not yet. Not because of you, because of me. Because of what I need to do first, and because I need to choose it clearly, without urgency, without fear, without the feeling that I'm accepting something because I'm grateful or desperate. She met his eyes. I want it to be a choice, not a reflex. Yes, he said, simply, without hurt. You're not going to argue. No, he said. I'm not. She breathed. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me for not pressuring you, he said. That's not a courtesy. That's a baseline. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest, that tight and careful thing that had been braced since before she could remember, shifted slightly. Not opening, just loosening, the way a fist loosened when it was no longer needed. She turned back to the map. He stayed. They stood there together in the quiet of the map room until the candle burned low, and neither of them needed to fill the silence. And that was perhaps the most honest thing she had experienced in years. The hearing convened on the 4th morning in the Territorial Arbitration Hall, a stone building in the nearest border settlement, neutral ground by compact law, with 3 arbiters seated at the high bench and representatives from every affected pack required to attend. Davin came with 4 men and a composed expression that did not reach his eyes. Corinna came in gray silk, pale and controlled, and looked at June across the hall with the particular expression of someone recalculating in real time. June looked back at her stepmother and felt, not hatred, which she had expected, but something colder and more precise. Clarity. The kind that came after you had stopped hoping someone was different from what they were. The documents were presented, authenticated by the arbiter's appointed recorder, who examined the seal, the parchment grade, the ink composition, and the registration marks against the Territorial Archive records. It took 40 minutes. June sat still through all of it, her hands flat on the table, her breathing even. When the recorder confirmed the documents as genuine and original, Corinna's composure cracked. Just once, just briefly, a single fracture across the surface of that carefully maintained presentation, Then it sealed over again. But June had seen it. The arbiters deliberated for less than an hour. The Ashvale Mountain Territory was declared held in trust under its original designation. The attempted transfer through the marriage contract, which had never been completed, the arbiters noted as the ceremony had not concluded, was ruled legally void. All secondary agreements Davin had entered into on the basis of projected ownership were similarly voided. Davin's PAC affiliation with the Greyvale Council was referred to the full Compact Council for investigation into conspiracy to commit fraud and the concealment of a person, Emmett, who had been held against his will on territory that fell under Greyvale jurisdiction. That investigation would take months, but it would happen. Corinna was placed under territorial restriction immediately. She could not leave the arbitration settlement pending the investigation's completion. Her access to the Ashvale estate was suspended. She stood when the ruling was read, and for one moment her eyes found June's across the room, and June looked back at her stepmother with nothing on her face at all, and then looked away. It was the last time she looked at Corinna with any particular attention. Some things did not deserve the weight of a final confrontation. Some things were simply finished. Outside the hall, in the cold, clear air of the border settlement, Emmett stood beside her and looked at the gray sky and exhaled. "It's over," he said. "The first part," she said. "The worst part." She considered. Yes, the worst part. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned briefly into him. Her brother, alive and standing, thinner than he should be but healing, would continue to heal, would come home with her to a place that was genuinely theirs now in a way it had not been since their father died. And she let herself feel the weight of that. Not performed, not contained, just real and present, and enough. Lucian stood a few feet away, speaking quietly with the arbiter's recorder, and did not look over. He was giving her the moment, which was something she had stopped expecting from people without realizing she had stopped expecting it. She straightened. Emmett dropped his arm. "We should go home," she said. "Which home?" he asked. "Ours," she said. "The mountain territory. We'll open the summer cabin first. Clear it out. Start from the foundation." She glanced at him. "Can you ride?" "Since 3 months ago," he said, slightly offended. "Good." She walked toward Lucian. He turned as she approached, finished the sentence he was saying to the recorder, and looked at her. "It's done," she said. "Yes. I want to go north, to the territory, Emmett and I." She held his gaze. "Will you—" She stopped, adjusted. "I am asking you to come, not for protection, not because I need a guard." She paused. "Because I want you there." Something in his face shifted. The same small shift she had been learning to read, the change in his expression that was his equivalent of what other people showed loudly. "Then I will come," he said. They rode north that afternoon, the 3 of them and a small guard, through the pine roads she was beginning to know, toward the mountain territory that smelled of snow and resin and old stone, and the particular cold clarity of land that had been waiting. The summer cabin needed work. That was an understatement. The roof had shed 2 tiles, the left shutter had split in the autumn storms, and something had made a home in the woodpile over winter that required diplomatic relocation. But the walls were sound, and the fireplace drew cleanly, and the view from the eastern window was exactly as she remembered. Ridge upon ridge of pine and sky, the mountain's upper face white with permanent snow, the valley below still and silver in the winter light. She stood at that window on the first evening and looked at it for a long time. She heard Lucian behind her, his particular quality of movement, which she had learned to distinguish from any other, unhurried and deliberate. And then he was beside her, not touching, looking at the same view. "My father used to say that land remembered," she said, "that it kept what happened on it, that if you paid attention, you could feel what it had held." "Do you believe that?" he asked. She looked at the ridgeline, at the last light catching the snow on the upper face, at the forest below, which was old enough to have been here before anything she knew. "Yes," she said. "I think I do." She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. "Of this. Of you." She paused. "Of what this is." "I know," he said. "I wanted to say it out loud. I'm glad you did." She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, careful and certain, and she felt the bond settle. Not arrive, because it had always been there. But settle, the way something settled when it was finally allowed its proper weight. Not a chain, not a pull, a completion, quiet and definitive, like the last word of a sentence that had been building for a long time. She looked back at the window, at the mountain, at the land that remembered. "We have work to do tomorrow," she said. "We do," he agreed. "The roof, the shutter. Emmett wants to clear the eastern path before the next snow." "Practical," he said, and she could hear the warmth in it, that contained warmth she had been learning to read, which was nothing like the performed warmth she had spent years trying to earn from people who had never intended to give it. "I am practical," she said. "You said so yourself." "I did," he said. "I wasn't wrong." She turned to look at him one more time. This man who had opened a door without conditions, and given her bread, and waited, and said when instead of if, and come north, because she had asked him to, and she thought, this is what it was supposed to feel like. Not perfect. Not without history or weight, or the long work of learning someone. But real. Chosen. Clear. She held his hand, and watched the last light leave the mountain. In the months that followed, the world rearranged itself the way worlds did after their foundations were corrected. The Compact Council's investigation concluded in early spring. Davin Ashford was stripped of his lord's title and his Pax Council seat, his assets frozen pending restitution review. He left the Eastern Territories quietly, which was how men like him always left. Not dramatically, not with the confrontation they had always deserved. Simply diminished and unremarkable, as if the size they had occupied had always been borrowed. Corinna faced formal compact proceedings that lasted 2 months. She was found to have conspired in the illegal detention of Emmett Ashvale, the fraudulent representation of land documents, and the planning of an act against June's person. She was stripped of her claim to the Ashvale name and exiled from the Eastern Territories permanently. She left in the same gray silk she had worn to the hearing, and June did not watch her go. Emmett spent the winter and the spring on the mountain territory, which was where he had always been best, outside, working with his hands, rebuilding things, learning the names of the people in the valley settlements below, who would become their neighbors. His shoulder healed fully. The shadows under his eyes lightened gradually. He laughed more. By summer. He laughed at things that were actually funny, which June considered a reliable indicator of a person returning to themselves. He also, by autumn, began riding regularly to the border settlement to the east, on what he described as administrative matters, and which June recognized without comment as something more personally motivated. She said nothing about it. She simply noted that he returned from those rides in better spirits, and left him to it. The summer cabin became a home. Not immediately, not without work. There was always work. The roof and the shutter and the eastern path and the garden and the records and the valley administration and the 100 small daily things that constituted a life actually lived rather than merely endured, but steadily and with the deep satisfaction of building something on a foundation that was genuinely yours. Lucian came and went between the mountain territory and Veyrath. He had 6 territories to administer and a compact that required his presence, and June had land to restore and a valley to learn, and neither of them required the other to stay in one place. But he came back. He always came back, and she always knew he was coming before he arrived. The bond a low, warm certainty in her chest. And when he rode through the gate, she did not perform welcome. She simply looked up from whatever she was doing, and let the gladness be visible, which was its own kind of arrival. They wed in late autumn, on the mountain territory, in the open air with the pine ridge behind them, and the sky the color of slate, and all the people they had chosen around them. No white roses. No chapel. No silk that cost more than honesty. June wore her mother's brooch, the only thing she had carried out of the old life that she wanted, and Lucian stood across from her with the same contained expression she had learned to read, the same steadiness that had been there from the beginning, and when they spoke the words of the compact bond, she heard them clearly. Not as formula, not as transaction, as choice, deliberate, clear, and irrevocable. Sarah cried, which she denied afterward with complete conviction, and which everyone present had the sense not to contest. Emmett stood beside his sister and held her hand until the moment she took Lucian's, and then let go, which was the right kind of letting go. Not loss, but completion. The mountain held its cold and its permanence and its long memory, and the wind came off the upper ridge the way it always had. And June Ashvale, Luna of the Veyroth territory, steward of the Ashvale mountain lands, daughter of a careful man who had believed that truth properly recorded did not require witnesses to survive, looked at the sky above the pine line and breathed the cold air into her lungs and understood, with the clarity of something finally and fully true, that she had not merely survived the worst of it, she had come through it and found the life that had always been meant to be hers, not given, not rescued into, walked toward, with her own feet, on her own terms, until she arrived. The end.